Derek Bristol has been involved in the exploration, survey, and cartography of Lechuguilla Cave since 2010. If you were able to tune in yesterday during the exploration talks, you may have caught his presentation, Recent Discoveries in the West Branch, Oz and Zion. In addition to his many survey projects, he has created over 170 short films that include tutorials on caving techniques, caving gear, reviews, and videos about documenting cave trips and expeditions across the world. With that, Derek, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Great. So I'm going to kind of try to quickly go through an update on where things stand with cartography in Lechuguilla. There's kind of a quick animation here that shows the cave. I think if you haven't heard, it recently passed 150 miles. Not a lot of people know that. But as you can see from the 3D model here, it's a very complex cave. It's there are mazier caves in the world, but the combination of the length of this cave and the three-dimensional complexity makes it a real challenge from a cartography standpoint. So there's you've seen in a lot of talks mention of some of the areas in the cave. I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but there's sort of three main branches. I think you're probably well aware of at this point. From a data standpoint, they're sort of split into the entrance section, and then there's the east, south, and west branches. And each of those branches is sort of divided into the near and far sections of those branches. So there's a near east and far east, which is a pretty obvious division, a near south and far south, which is maybe a little less obvious, and then a near west and far west. And so the data is sort of managed that way. And then I'll talk a little bit later about how the cave is divided up for cartographic purposes. These sort of volumetric models or 3D models are quite easy to generate. We're using Compass, which is written by Larry Fish, as our data management software. And that has the ability to take not only the centerline survey data, but also the left, right, up and down dimensions from each survey station and generate sort of a simulated 3D model from that. And so with very little effort, the computer can generate maps that look like this. So if you want to get a general sense for the entire cave, you would do that. But most of the cartography I'm going to talk about is sort of detailed maps of different sections of the cave that could be used for navigation and science and things like that. So this is an older map, not the latest line plot, but showing where the cave is with a topographic overlay. The entrance, there's a single entrance that's at about 4,600 feet elevation. It's in Lechuguilla Canyon. And you can see that the cave then drops down from the entrance and goes underneath Lechuguilla Canyon. And the rift the southern end of the rift is where the three branches of the cave split from one another. That's more or less right underneath Lechuguilla Canyon. So the east branch of the cave is on the east side of that canyon, and the south and west branches are on the west side of that canyon. And there's a deeper canyon to the south of the cave, that's Walnut Canyon. And you can see the very southern end of High Hopes in the south branch sits right underneath Walnut Canyon. The cave is plenty deep enough to go underneath these nearby canyons. So most of the development of the cave is about 1,000 feet vertically below the entrance. So down around 3,600 feet in elevation, and most of the bottoms of these canyons are well above 4,000 feet. Just north of this area is Dark Canyon, which is on BLM land, and you heard Jim Goodbar and others talk about that area and being BLM and being a target for mineral extraction development, and how it's now protected, which is good. There's definitely potential for the cave to go in that direction, and Dark Canyon's quite a bit lower than some of these other canyons you see here, but I think it's at 41 or 4,200 feet still. So there's definitely potential that the cave could go under that. A little bit of just overview or general information about the cartography. I mentioned already if you haven't heard yet, the cave's 150 miles. It's the 8th longest cave in the world at present. Those numbers kind of move around from year to year. There's been some, I think Lechuguilla was quickly catching up to Wind Cave in South Dakota, which is 154 miles right now, and is the 7th longest cave. But there's been some recent renewed activity in Wind Cave. But over the last couple of years, Lech has been adding 4 or 5 miles a year to the surveyed length. Wind Cave typically adds about 1.5 miles per year. So if things get back to normal after the pandemic passes and exploration resumes, I think within a few years we may see Lech pass Wind Cave in length. There are 12 cartographers at present. That's also a number that's in flux. About 2/3 of those have been involved for a while. The other third are relatively new, relatively meaning in the last 2 years or so. And I'll kind of go through section by section who's working on different areas of the cave. And right now we have 25 sections. And I've got a overview map that shows those sections. We used to use quadrangles, although most people didn't really follow those. But there were roughly 25 quadrangles, and we've now switched to section maps, and there's roughly the same number, but the divisions and boundaries have changed quite a bit. We've transitioned to all digital cartography. So in the early days of Lech cartography, there was a lot of Mylar and pencil maps that were being generated, and those have been scanned, but they're not really in a digital format where they can be updated as new survey is added and as loops are closed and blunders are fixed. So we've moved to all digital cartography. Most people are using Adobe Illustrator for drafting. I mentioned already that we're using Compass data survey management software for data management, which does the compiling and loop closure error distribution. I don't know if any of the cartographers are using Inkscape, but we're in a vector graphics program of some type for the cartography, and everybody's using that method now. We aren't really using round tripping. Fairly certain none of the cartographers are doing this. This is a process where as loops get fixed or new loops are created, the data moves around a bit. So the error gets redistributed, and that changes the coordinates of the survey stations slightly. And sometimes it moves them enough that what's been drafted no longer fits the survey data. And round tripping is a process that can be used in some caves to help automatically morph what's been drafted to fit the new data, but it doesn't work very well in 3-dimensionally complex caves, so which Lechuguilla certainly is. So where you have a fixed loop in an upper level, the software has no way of determining what drafted elements are on an upper level versus a lower level. And so round tripping isn't very effective. It's still very easy to kind of cut and paste sections of the map to get it to conform to the new line plot. So there's still advantages in digital cartography, but we're not using this automatic round tripping process that is useful in some 2-dimensionally complex caves. And then I'll mention that the data management and cartography is being coordinated by the Cave Resources Office in Carlsbad Cav-ern, and that's Erin Lynch. So she's the chief cat herder. A little bit of general information about the survey. I don't think a lot of this has been mentioned. I won't go through all of this in detail, but there have been a little over 3,300 surveys now over the 35-year history. That adds up to about 50,000 survey shots. And the included length is pretty close to 800,000 feet now, which is, again, just over 150 miles. The total survey, we didn't have a big celebration about this, but the total survey recently surpassed 1 million feet. So it's like 1,008,000 feet is the total survey. So there's another 200,000 feet that's resurvey or redundant shots and things like that. But from a caver perspective, all of that feels about the same, takes about the same time and effort to generate. But there is another 200,000 feet of excluded data that's in the data set. But you can see the breakdown by the different branches of the cave. There's sort of a pie graph that shows that. About 5% of the survey is in the entrance section. That's the entrance and the rift. And then about 45% is in the west branch, and then roughly 25% each in the south and east branches of the cave. And again, there's over 3,300 surveys divided by 35 years of survey effort equates to about 100 surveys per year. Survey is a team going out for a day. So if you have an expedition and you got 2 teams in the cave, that typically breaks down to 6 days of survey. So you'd have 12 surveys worth of data coming out of the cave. So the average is about 100 per year, and that changes considerably from year to year. I've already mentioned that Compass is being used for data management, and I think that's been pretty effective. I think there's some argument about what the best software is, but once you pick one, it makes sense to sort of stick with it. Compass has a pretty user-friendly data entry interface, and we've gone back and forth over the years with who enters the data. The data is the oversight and management of the data is being done by the Cave Resources Office, but a lot of data entry is now being done by individual teams and volunteer cavers on private expeditions are doing the data entry. And then if you look at all of that, those 50,000 survey shots, there's about 3,500 loops. These are places where the survey comes back in and ties back into known stations. And these loops are very useful for identifying problems with data that's in that loop and sort of judging the quality of the survey. And they're sort of an expected amount of loop closure. We know that every time you take a reading, you get some error in the distance and the azimuth and the inclination data that you collect. And those are what we would call random errors. And so over any of these loops, you'd have sort of an expected amount of error, and the Compass software spits out a standard deviation number. So if it's less than 1 standard deviation, we generally consider that to be good. It's within what you would expect closure error to be. And so of those 3,500 loops, about 75% are in the good category. Between 1 and 2 standard deviations, the software classifies those as okay. With modern survey standards, doing backsites, and especially now with Disto-X's, we rarely get survey loops that are greater than 1 standard deviation, but 1 to 2 is possible, especially in shorter loops where there are loops in the cave with only 3 shots in them. And so with a small loop, a small error in any of the readings can give you a higher standard deviation, but about 22% of the loops are in that 1 to 2 standard deviation range. We generally don't worry about trying to look for problems or try to fix things if they're in that range. And then the last category is bad loops. So that's anything with more than 2 standard deviations. That's usually in excess of what we expect. And there's still 130 loops or 4% that are in that category. So any of the cartographers that take on a section, one of the first things they typically do is try to fix any bad loops, because you don't want to start drafting on bad data, because if they get fixed later, it's going to create problems. There's going to be more morphing and stuff required. So it's kind of a chart of what the survey has looked like year by year over the past 35 years. You can see that when the cave was broken into in '86, within the first couple of years, there was a big spike in activity. And then there's a few lulls in the survey since then. The big one in '92 was when Lechuguilla Cave project was shut down and Learn was created. So there weren't many trips or expeditions during that period of time. So that's a big one there. Sort of the next big lull was when the entrance airlock was installed and the cave was closed, or restricted. Access was more restricted in that 2001, 2002 timeframe. So there were fewer trips happening at that time. And there was a big drop in 2014, 2015, when the Cave Resources Office went from a staff of 4 down to a staff of 1 for an extended period of time. So that slowed things down. And The most recent thing, of course, is the pandemic. So this year there's been kind of a cutback. You can still see there's almost 2 miles of survey that's happened in 2020, but that was all in the January, February timeframe. So anyway, if you ignore those lulls, which are sort of caused by specific things that have happened in the last 20 years or so, there's been fairly consistent output of 20 to 30,000 feet of survey each year. And every time there's been kind of a lull, there's a bit of a backlog, I guess. And so when things resume, I think we'll see a big spike again in survey output. I'm not going to go into this in detail. It's a little flow chart of kind of a general process of how we go from collecting survey data in the cave to generating a map and what we do with that map. But there's a big part of it is the survey data management. So entering the data, analyzing these loops, looking for problems with data entry or errors in the survey data itself. We do collect backsites on all our measurements, and so we can catch some of those problems. And there have been successful so-called office expeditions where time is spent just with the data and analyzing loops and looking back at original sketch notes and finding problems and fixing them without going underground. And then that survey data is then used for the drafting process. Again, I won't go into this in detail, but one of the things that there's been a push for recently has been to try to standardize these map sheets. So again, we've got roughly 25 map sheets. Each of the cartographers are volunteers, and so they're all using individual styles for drafting these maps. And so the maps look quite a bit different from one another. And there's been a lot of discussion and trying to reach some consensus on how to standardize the look and feel of the maps that are being created for improved consistency. So some of the basic elements that you would find on any map would be things like the frame, the title, the legend, the scale bar, the north arrow. For Lech maps, it's generally advised to have a reference map because you're doing a portion of the overall cave. So it's good to have a map to show where in the cave this section map is located. And then there's usually some description about who was involved in the surveys. Even the survey designations are oftentimes included and things like that. And so having kind of a standardized layout or frame for the map, I think, is a good way to move towards standardization. And we've the park has generated what you see in the upper right there is kind of a template for use. The different map sheets are different sizes, so that can be adjusted easily enough, especially with digital cartography. But that standard format is sort of what's being proposed right now. And then we get a little more controversial as we go down the list here. The next thing is drafting style. So that's the fonts that are used, the type size, so for labels and things like that, and the line weights for walls and for things like breakdown blocks and other drawing elements in the cave map. There's a desire to try to standardize around those so that, again, the maps look consistent from one map sheet to the next. And then the next thing is drawing elements. So that would be things like the symbols that are used for speleothems or speleoclasts, the brushes that are used for floor and ceiling ledges or flowstone, and then swatches, which is another way of saying patterns. So things like sediment floor, mud floor, gravel, pools, things like that. There's a desire to try to standardize around those things as well. And as you go down this list, these the symbols that are used, again, there are stylistic preferences from one cartographer to the next. And so there's been some discussion and trying to come to, again, some sort of consensus about making the maps look more alike from one to the next. And then the last thing, which is probably the most controversial, is the use of color. Most cave maps are pretty black and white. Sometimes blue is used to denote pools or flowing water. There's not much flowing water in Lechuguilla, but many cartographers now are using background colors to make the map stand out, and using colors for things like corrosion residue, different types of corrosion residue, or even to denote different levels of the cave to make it more visually apparent. And those, the use of those colors and the way that they're used and outlined and so on is very there's some very strong stylistic preferences. And some of the cartographers that are essentially finished or updated, that have their maps updated, are sort of reluctant to want to change those. And so there's been some talk and negotiation around that. But anyway, I just want to let you know that there's some effort to try to standardize those things. I'm going to talk a little bit, just real briefly. This is the old system that was used to kind of split up the cave into manageable areas that could be drafted. And it was called the Quadrangle System. Each of these quads was 1,500 feet east to west and 1,000 feet north to south. And we're drafting these maps at 1 inch to 50 feet, which is a 1 to 600 scale. The cave is roughly 2 miles east to west, a little over 10,000 feet, and it's about a mile from north to south. So the whole cave sits under about 2 square miles. And again, the scale, 1 to 600 scale, is a good one to give you good detail, but not an excessive amount, I guess. We typically sketch between 1 inch equals 20 feet and 1 inch equals 40 feet. So that's 1 to 240 up to 1 to 480 scales in the cave. And then we translate that into 1 to 600 for the finished maps. But this was kind of a standard grid that was used for a while. Again, if you add all these up, there's about 25 of them, but pretty much everybody ignored them because commonly the quad boundary would be in an inconvenient place, and you might have a passage that you're drafting and it just barely goes off the edge of that boundary. So most people were sort of ignoring them and drafting maps of sort of naturally divided sections of the cave. And we've sort of made that more official recently. This is a rough draft of a section map guide that shows the identification of sort of natural divisions within the cave itself and who the cartographers that are assigned to those sections are. Again, there's about the same number of sections as there were quad maps. 25 right now is my count, and that's divided up amongst 12 cartographers. So I'll kind of talk about each of those sections real briefly. Paul Berger is working on the 2 entrance sections. So there's the entrance itself, which includes Boulder Falls and Glacier Bay. And his maps are very clean and mostly updated. So there's been a lot of recent new survey and resurvey in the entrance section. Glacier Bay got resurveyed recently. And so all of that's been updated. So you can see Paul's entrance map on the upper right there. And then Paul also is doing the rift. There's an upper and lower rift. He's got those as separate levels, but that includes EF Junction and North Rift as well. And you can see that map in the lower right, the lower left there. First is pretty complex. There's a little animation there that shows it. It's a very mazy part of the cave, very difficult to draft, but you can see that right now it's sort of in profile animation. And you can see there's definitely an upper level and lower level that are sort of divided and not a lot in between. And if I understood Ron Miller's talk, there's still only, I think, one sort of route down, which is Gorilla Pit down to Ruby Chamber to get from that upper level to the lower level. Certainly the most traveled, I guess. But the upper level sort of been split between Johanna Kovarik, who's going to do from camp basically east, and that includes La Mirada, Happy Hunting Grounds, Boundary Waters, Los Picos River areas. And then the upper level west of camp between Aragonite Mare, which is the dividing point between the near and far east, and camp, Steve Gladue and David Engel are going to be working on that, and they've divided that up into plan view, which Steve's going to do, and profile view that David's going to do. And there's a map down in the bottom right there. That's one from Joel Despain. That was an older map, but I think Johanna and Steve and David have been looking at the data and organizing it and getting sketch notes together, but they haven't started drafting yet. But they're basically dividing up that upper far east and and doing that. And then there's 3 cartographers in the lower part of the Far East. Aria Mildice is doing the Coral Sea, which you heard about from Ron Miller yesterday, and she's started to put pen to paper, and she's begun drafting Hall of the Dancing Bears and Independence Hall. And so she's got that area. And then the rest of the Outback, I think there's still a little bit of discussion about where to draw the dividing line, but Nick Saki's got an area called Ruby's Basement, and the rest of the Outback is going to be Pat Gambisis. They have not, Pat's got some older maps, but I think she's, her maps in kind of draft condition, and Nick is just getting ready to start drafting. But one of the issues that I think all of the people in the southern part of the southern part of the Far East are struggling with is that the passage out there is not well behaved. Everything is sort of these 45-degree angle fissures that interconnect with one another, and drafting that is going to be a real challenge for them. One of Pat's strategies she mentioned is going back in and resurveying one level at a time and sort of focusing on a level and how the passages interconnect. Because taking the original survey notes, a lot of times people would pass through in a fissure at one level and sort of sketch what was directly around them. And then somebody else would come through 50 feet below in the same exact fissure and sketch that. But because it's angled at 45 degrees, it looks like 2 different passages when it's really the same passage, just tilted. So it's a cartographic challenge for sure. The Near East.
My cat would like to let you know that you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you, Andrea. So the Near East, Rod Harks is doing the lower level, the Rusticles area, and that's pretty well up to date. Nice map. He uses a lot of color that, again, it's going to be a struggle getting people to walk back their changes if we do agree to kind of standardize. But beautiful map there in the lower Near East. That includes Moby Dick Room, Nirvana, the bottom of Apricot Pit, and the upper level Ghost Town area, which includes most of Apricot Pit, S&M Crawl, and Ghost Town itself is being drafted by Ben Tobin, and he's just getting started. I think he said he's about 50% done with the drafting. There's a little bit less survey footage up there, but he's got to start on that. I think that's an area that Paul Berger had done previously, and Ben's taken that over. And so there's some work being done there. So that's the Near East. Far South, everything in the Far South is being done by Paul Berger. There's the High Hopes area, Tower Place, Lechy's Lair, Chicken Little. I didn't show those maps, but there's kind of another section out there that Paul has split out based on level, and then the Deliverance Passage. And so more or less everything in the Far South is in good shape and up to date. There hasn't been a lot of new survey out there for a number of years, but the maps and the cartography are pretty well caught up there. And I should mention here that from cartographer to cartographer, there's sort of differences in the way that cross sections and profiles are being used. Paul does relatively few profiles, and it's difficult to do in a lot of Lechuguilla because it's so complex and mazy. And so the profiles are being used very sparingly, I think, by a few cartographers and few select instances. The Near South, there's really 3 sections there. The Voids, which Hazel is working on, I think is about 90% up to date. She's made a lot of good progress there. Another extremely complex area. I think she has 7 different levels to try to make sense of that 3D maze. The Chandelier Maze, I don't think anybody's worked on for a while. It's assigned to Pat Cambises. She's using the same strategy there as the Outback, which is to try to go in and resurvey level by level. This is one where I think when you look at the line plot, the levels don't organize themselves very easily. So it's a very difficult thing, and that's obviously an important area because it contains things like the Chandelier Ballroom, Berkeley Ice Cube Room, which are popular areas. Lake LaBarge is being done by Max Wishak, and that's more or less up to date. The cartography is 100% up to date, and I think Max has said for his sections, the exploration might be 90% done. Of course, that's all speculation, but he's definitely in mop-up mode in a lot of his areas. So that includes the new area, Neuland, that was discovered 2014, Labarge borehole in Lake Labarge. In the far west, I'm doing a rather large area that included 4 of the old quadrangles merged into one. That includes Promised Land, Keel Hall, Sanctuary, and that's about 90% updated. Southern Climbs and South Winds, it's another Max Wieszak section map, is again, cartographically, it's 100% done. One of the more beautiful maps, I have to say, a lot of color. Again, if we standardize, I think Max would say we should standardize on his colors rather than going to black and white. But it definitely is a very effective use of color, in my opinion. The Oz map is another one that I'm doing. That's probably about, cartographically, it's about 90% done, but I've started to split out profile and plan views, so I'm kind of revamping that. And then there's a couple areas out in the west that there's still some negotiation needed to figure out where the boundaries are going to be, but the Northwest Passage, which was previously done by Peter Bosted, the Hard Day's Night area was also done by Peter Bosted, and Max and I are kind of splitting up those areas, and there's still some negotiation, but neither of us have really started on drafting those. So there's an older maps by Peter, but nothing recent has happened. On the near west, basically 2 map sheets: Chandelier Graveyard, Manifest Destiny by
Derek, we're going to need you to finish up now.
Hey, okay, by Hazel, and then Deep Seas by Max. So last thing I mentioned is that at the convention next summer, assuming things are back to normal, there's going to be a session on the cartography. All the maps will be updated and printed. So we've set that as a goal for cartographers to finish. And we're probably going to do wall maps, but there's been some talk about a floor map. And so if you're at convention next summer, look for that, and you can get to see all these maps in their updated state. Thanks for your time and attention. Sorry for going a minute over.